The warp, a realm of pure psychic energy, a reflection of our thoughts and feelings made manifest. Its influence is not bound to the confines of one universe, but is spread wide among the ever-diverging tracks of the multiverse. This is one such track, the Angel Apostasy.
He heard their screams through the gale of cutting mountain air. Different from the cries of steeled panic as they chased him, blood doused with one of their flock freshly slain and hoisted upon his shoulder, these were of frenzied terror. He looked down to see a massive serpent between the men and the cliff face. Its head swung up, revealing a boy, sinking inexorably down between its dislocated jaws. Feathers ran down the beast's long body, buffering the impact from the shepherd's crooks and long knives. Impotent, all they could do was watch as the boy was slowly devoured. Watch and plead to Perturabo above. Perturabo sunk the fingers of his right hand into the stone as he stretched out for a better view. He could see tiny, agonized faces beseech him, while cold reptilian eyes stared unfocused at the sky as it undulated its meal down its gullet. An ache tugged at Perturabo's chest to move, while his mind protested. He ran one mental simulation after another automatically. The results translated to numbers in his mind, none of which were promising. It had been nearly a minute now, and the feathered monster began to unfurl, having swallowed the boy halfway to his shoulders. He would find a calculation where the impulse outweighed the risk. He enjoyed the chase, and their loss may discourage future risk. Frolicking did not justify the potential permanent loss of motor faculties. The impulse itself was important. The fact that he wanted to do it means he should. He was made for a purpose. Naturalistic fallacy. He was impressed with their courage to fight in the face of obvious death. It was illogical. It was all entirely illogical. The serpent stretched out, its tail swiped away the excess prey and began to leave. Knocked to the floor, the older man who always led the chase locked eyes with Perturabo despite the distance and let out one last desperate howl. In a tongue Perturabo had begun to master without ever learning he understood. "Help us," the man wailed. "Help us!" Face hot despite the wind, his ears rang with no noise, and his nose twitched above a scrunched mouth. Perturabo's fingers released. He pushed off, away from the mountain and out towards his fate.
Perturabo, a worshipper at the altar of logic, a mind unique in the galaxy, gifted even for a demigod. Alone, he was not in the unfortunate fate that many children are to endure. Requests of dutiful love, a thin veneer wrapping an exploitation of their talents. Two avenues are left for the young and defenseless. The direct or emotional choose a righteous rebellion. Others, too proud to be viewed as helpless or incompetent, resign themselves to their fate, resentfully stewing in a discomfort increasingly of their own making. The only thing to match Perturabo's intellect was his pride, and so he was used and abused like a cheap tool. Any appreciation of his mastery was perceived as self-serving. This left the boy, once warm in earnest altruism, as a rusted man, cold as iron to the galaxy around him. What if this boy, so full of promise, made the illogical choice of love when it mattered most, and received love in return? Stranger things have happened in the warp.
Toes pointed down with arms raised above his head, he shot down like a bolt from the heavens and pierced the hide of the great serpent. With a shrill, the beast involuntarily regurgitated his prize and writhed in agony. Perturabo felt muscles split beneath his feet and bones shatter as his toes passed through them. He had sunk waist-deep into the creature. With one mighty push, he freed himself, vaulting both legs over the feathered side. The moment his feet touched the ground, he darted toward the shepherds. So fast was he that their only reaction was a flinched stagger as he ripped each of the weapons from their grasps. From the last man he swiped a rope, used to bridle the more willful of the flock. Hands whirled the rope around the three roughly similar crooks, and two long knives with instinctive competence. He yanked the rope through a complicated knot and held aloft a makeshift bident in his hand. After examining it for a quarter of a second and giving an imperceptible nod of approval, he was off. The serpent ceased its thrashing when Perturabo hoisted himself upon its hide. Its head spun around and reared back for a strike, but it was not quick enough. In that time, Perturabo had gained his footing, leaned back and swung the bident into the gaping wound. Metal dug deep and he began to drag the blade up its length, flaying it like a fish. He was halfway up the beast when its head slammed into his body. He turned with the blow, robbing it of any power. However, he would be bitten back in another way, as the devastating laceration he had inflicted caused the creature to cry out. Its dagger-like teeth caught his leg, rending it wide from thigh to foot. Indefatigable, he twisted around the lunging beast and was able to grab onto the feathers behind its head. Through it all, his face had not changed, despite the bone of his leg exposed to the cool air. He tried to plunge his weapon into its hide to no avail. Feathers, scales, and skin were far too thick for the measly blades to pierce at this suboptimal angle. He was running out of options as his decommissioned leg prevented him from repeating his previous maneuver. The serpent began swinging around its head, attempting to throw him off. Perturabo held tight, but when the beast started slamming itself against the rocks, he could feel feathers come loose, and he knew it was a matter of time. He let the bident fall in his hand and caught a hook at the end of the crooks. When the beast reared for another blow against the rocks, Perturabo swung the bident around its neck, let loose his grip upon the feathers, and snatched the end of the blades. The edges alone would do nothing to his hand, but the force with which he gripped them sunk the bent metal deep and began to draw quickly coagulating blood. With all of the strength in his arms and back, he pulled. The bundle was tied excellently, the rope interweaved to support and hold the canes together, and like its wielder, it had not even creaked in strain, even under such extreme pressures. The same could not be said about the serpent. It gagged and gasped for air, every convulsion giving way to the vice grip's endless squeeze. Frenzied now, it slammed its body recklessly. Its head crashed into the mountainside. Its midsection flailed on the floor, and its tail ineptly flapped, the bones and connecting tissues destroyed. All the while, the strain from Perturabo's squeeze increased the beast's blood pressure, causing a comical geyser of blood to spray from its wounds. Woozy and desperate, it reared up as far as it was able and fell. It dashed itself upon the mountain, and Perturabo was crushed between the two. It twitched and flailed before seemingly succumbing to its wounds. The shepherds, having long since secured the boy and retreated, slowly crept back to see the slain beast. Walking from its tail towards its head, they saw the crushed scales beneath their wooden canes, two hands still firmly gripping the ends. Hesitant and unsure how to approach lifting the beast, they were startled when the hands pulled with one last mighty tug, causing the beast to spasm and finally die. The hands released the impromptu weapon, and a moment later the massive beast began to move. Despite themselves, cold sweat of primal fear ran down their backs before enough of the serpent was up to see Perturabo pressing it. They ran to help, lifting what they could, and Perturabo made it to one knee. Baring his teeth now, he hoisted it above his head, standing on one good leg. He pushed it up, it dropped behind him, and he fell forward, blood loss finally taking its toll. He felt hands catch him as he blacked out. Perturabo's senses flooded his consciousness as he came to. He had been subconsciously recording and processing information while he rested. He quickly went through it as if he were reading a book, and knew he was in the shepherd's bed before he opened his eyes. The tingle of cooked herbs infused within savoury roasted meat tantalized his nose for the first time. He had catalogued muddled variations on the men before, but the vibrant richness of the sensation urged his mouth to salivate, but he suppressed it. He heard someone standing around a cooking fire on the far side of the room. She was like him, but different, her voice a higher pitch, footsteps lighter, her smell more pleasant. The word woman appeared in his mind, although he had never seen one. He knew the shepherd was at the door before he tromped in and gave the women the large bundle of wood. Perturabo opened his eyes and sat up. He looked around the dim room, sparsely lit by candle and the cooking flame. It was roughly the size of the cave he had taken shelter in. "My son, he awakes." The woman across the room wiped her hands clean on the rag hanging from her apron and walked forward. The weight of years and children gathered around her hips, but the sharp ice blue of her eyes was a youthful match for Perturabo's own. The woman fussed over him, fluffed his pillow, brought him a tray of honeyed milk and meat, and even elevated his legs with bundles of skins. Perturabo sat a statue and observed, "Mene, please." The shepherd took a step towards her. The boy has his own mother. Anyone who would save my little Saikula is my son," she said, pinching the little give of flesh that Perturabo's chiseled face would allow. "But the boy is different. Special. He could be of the gods." "Then they will have to share?" She got close to Perturabo and held his chin in her hand. "Mothers do not leave their boys to die out in the wilds." She looked back at the shepherd for a moment, before turning back, "Especially one of the gods." She let go of his face, stood back, and with her hands on her hips, she smiled with eyes emanating a warmth that filled Perturabo's chest. "Now, if I am to be your mother, you must know me, and I must know you. I am Alcmene, and my husband, Amphion. Tell me your name, child." "Perturabo," he choked through unpracticed lips. "He can speak?" Amphion stopped mid-sit in his chair near the fire. With a soft sigh, Alcmene said, "It sounds foreign, but beautiful." He finally allowed himself to look away and examine the state of his body. He removed the skins which served as his blanket and confirmed what he knew waited for him. One leg was a child's clay rendition of the marble masterwork that mirrored it. Broken and off, in places it was bulbous and others caved in. A massive scar knit the irregular shapes of meat and bone together. He swung his legs over and stood. To the others in the room, he was as statuesque as before, but Perturabo knew the wrongness of his form. His balance was entirely off, and despite the look of it, he knew his mal-heeled limb would snap under far too little pressure. As he sat back down, he felt the edge of his toe catch on a floorboard. He would have to account for the askew placement of his toes from now on. Amphion coughed. "The nearest physician is a 2 days' ride away. I had sent the 2 boys, but after replacing your bandages, it had already healed so much, we had no time to set it. Honestly, you were covered in so much of the Yalpia's toxic blood, I was surprised you survived at all." Alcmene shot the shepherd a glare. Perturabo examined the rest of his body. The skins, which stickily clung to his frame, were gone, replaced with linens which hung with ample room. He knew every material of its composition, as well as the techniques used to craft it. He thumbed the weak spot he instinctively recognized would unravel the entire shirt. "You like it? I made it myself. No self-respecting son of a shepherd would be caught wearing just skins. It would tell others we don't even know our own business," Alcmene said with a wink. "I like it," Perturabo was able to garble out. His sample size of words was too small for complex thought, but he had enough to narrow the syntax down for basic communication. "I still don't know, Minna. What if his presence brings them to us?" Amphion leaned on his elbow and spoke between his gloved finger and thumb that rested on his lips. With a flustered huff, Alcmene marched over to Amphion, who stood up. She argued and poked at his chest as he put his hands out defensively. After a moment, a voice broke their routine bickering. "I can make it better. Needle, please," he said, holding out his hand. Alcmene's eyes widened with shock, beyond any chafing at his direct challenge to her tailoring skills. She walked back to him and, without looking, plucked a needle from her apron, pulled a small spool of thread from its pocket, and handed both to Perturabo. He grabbed it with the timid gentleness of a child picking up a wounded bird. He placed them down upon his blanket and removed his shirt. His hands were slow and deliberate at first, as he methodically loosened the spool and threaded the needle. The change in his pace was sudden. A perfectly calibrated machine, his hands a blur to the awestruck onlookers. After less than a minute, he presented not only a shirt, but a pair of gloves as well. Alcmene looked at the gloves for a second before handing them off and examining the shirt. It was perfect, utterly seamless, as if it grew like a plant exactly as is. Perturabo spoke after a moment. "I made the gloves out of the spare." His pronunciation sharpened. "A replacement. Those are wearing." Amphion looked down at his tattered gloves and replaced one. "A perfect fit," he whispered to himself. He held his hand out in front of him and turned it to examine its back when his jaw went limp and face drained of blood. Where did you get this from?" He held the backside of the glove out to Perturabo, showing an embroidered owl encircled by a meander pattern. Perturabo tilted his head and pointed to a piece of purple silken cloth with blue embroidery sitting on the bed. While you were talking, I noticed a plank on the floor askew. It just came up and I found the fabric there. That's it! No more! He threw the gloves on the fire to Alkmaeon's protest and stomped to the bed, grabbed the cloth, threw it in the hole and sealed it shut once more. He has to go. I will not risk my family again. Ears red, Alkmaeon began to chew him out, but Amphion just stood and took it with eyes wide and his chin up. Without a word, Perturabo shakily walked out of their home. The door had slowly closed on its own by the time the two noticed Perturabo had left. Alkmaeon rushed to the entryway and saw Perturabo weighing 2 melon-sized rocks down the road. Amphion joined her, and they both watched as he discarded one, and without hesitation, brought it down on his deformed leg with a wet crunch. Flecks of blood splattered across his dispassionate face after multiple blows. Amphion cringed, with empathetic aching in his knees, as the sounds of cracked and grinding bone from Perturabo readjusting his leg reached him. Once satisfied, Perturabo turned back to see Amphion holding his wife's shoulders while she stared wide-eyed and mouth agape. Alkmaeon ran inside and back out again, and dropped to her knees in front of Perturabo, hands full with clean linen and a covered jar. "By the gods, what are you doing?" Perturabo stood with his weight on his good leg. The other extended out and rested on its heel. While pulped and lacerated, it now vaguely took on the shape of his other. It was off, and would only get worse. This will set better, he said with the mild innocence of a child reporting on the start of rain. Please just stay still. This will help it heal. She worked as she spoke. A strong herbal smell assaulted Perturabos' senses as she opened the jar's lid and gently rubbed the pale green paste on the edges of his ravaged flesh. You mustn't shed your blood so carelessly. Every drop is a gift, like each day we live. It must be cherished and spent wisely. As she began to apply pressure and wrap his leg, she noticed the gushing blood had slowed down to a trickle. The grievous wound stitched itself. Let's go back inside. You need to rest while your leg heals. She gently pulled on his arm, but he remained intransigent. I will go back to my shelter. Amphion does not want me here, Perturabo said matter-of-factly. She looked at him, confused for a moment, and then softened. You can't leave. You're hurt, and it's unsafe. Listen, it's not that Amphion doesn't want you here. He worried so much about you while you were resting. He stayed with you through the night to make sure you were okay. He truly is incredibly grateful for what you have done. It's just he is concerned for our safety. Puzzled, Perturabo said, Why? I will not harm any of you. It is not that, dear. It's complicated. People are complicated. They can be unclear and stubborn at times, but are worth it. She picked up a pebble, held it up for Perturabo to see, and dropped it. She repeated the action. People may not be as obvious as what will happen if I drop that stone again. But the love for them is just as natural. That's why you helped my Hector, right? Perturabo just looked at her. A young man with a mane of thick black hair wiped the sweat from his brow, dropped a wooden hammer into its loop in his leather apron, and with hands on his hips admired his work. Another man of seemingly the same age, with short-cropped hair partially obscured by a bandage, slapped a hand on his shoulder and joined him in admiration. Beautiful design and craftsmanship. And you wanted to do it all yourself? The bandaged man turned to face the other and said with a stupid grin, You nearly died because you could not follow directions at Isinus. Hector came out from behind their newly crafted dwelling. Like you did much better in our brother's 30-step process. You made it to what, 11? How is your hand? Hector gingerly touched the back of his bruised hand. Perturabo, you really need to slow down and explain as you go. Anyway, Aticinus closed his eyes and waved the events away. How could I come home every day and sleep under a roof I had no hand in making? Perturabo turned his head. The same way you use your knife, or the scythe, or the aqua... Aticinus recoiled, clutching his chest at such a devastating blow. How could I possibly turn down such a masterfully crafted gift from my beloved little brother? or deny our family the fruits of the labor that you insisted on working on while I was away, fetching Hector from the city. He shook his head and made a face at the thought. You know that is a bi-weekly errand at this point. It's not my fault the women of the town find me irresistible. Someone has to actually sell the fruits of our labor. We cannot subsist on our flock alone. Well, except for you, Perturabo. Aticinus smiled and gently pushed Hector's shoulder. He could survive on only the rocks between your ears and still be bigger than you. Not so little anymore, Hector said as he shoved Aticinus into Perturabo. Any day now I'll sprout, and we'll both be taller than you. And I bet Perturabo will become a man sooner as well, even if it takes him twice as long to figure out how to do it. Hector smiled smugly before Aticinus slammed into him. They began to wrestle as Aticinus said, The only thing you're sprouting is that wispy patch. I'm sure the woman in town merely thought you were a babe in need of milk. A moment later, Perturabo grabbed both of them in a dual vice-grip headlock and said, I do not understand why you all need to be so cruel to one another. Blood or no, we are brothers. We should help each other. Help yourself to this, Hector said, laughing as he started to kick at Perturbabus's ankle. Aticinus was about to join in when he noticed the stern sadness etched on Perturbabo's face. He stopped struggling and tapped Hector's shoulder. He tapped a few times more before awkwardly kicking his backside. Hector barked at him, but Aticinus gestured up to Perturabo with his head. Bo, can you let us go and sit down for a second? Aticinus said, gently pushing at his arm. My name is Perturabo. I know, just let go for a second. He pushed harder until Perturabo relented, releasing them both. You know we don't mean it, right? It's just a joke, Hector said, rubbing his neck. A joke? A joke? How? Perturabo squinted a little. The rude remarks, the wrestling, the shortening of your name when I know you don't care for it. It's all just to poke at each other, Aticinus said. That just sounds unpleasant and confusing, Perturabo frowned. Hector tried to explain, but only hummed and hawed before Aticinus spoke up again. It's not to break you down, but a sign of camaraderie, of friendship. To let you know without saying that you know, despite you being a giant pile of brain and muscle, we still view you as the same. As family. Perturabo's brow rustled. How do I know the difference between a joke and trying to hurt each other? Aticinus smiled, because one is rooted in affection and the other is not. Perturabo's frown broke, and his mood seemed to improve. I think I can empathize with your instruction troubles. Perturabo wryly smiled. Thank you both for your patience. I appreciate it. Hector gently punched Perturabo's arm. You wouldn't know it from looking at you, but you're pretty soft on the inside. Perturabo grabbed him by the head again. And you're unmistakably soft on the outside. Aticinus laughed as he grabbed Perturabo from behind, vainly attempting to choke him out to release Hector. Perturabo stopped for a moment in thought. His brothers tugged at a statue. Are the women of the city so enticing that you would endure father's cane this often? I do not understand. You will, Hector said, punctuated with a smirk. Women. If you're worried about them at a time like this, you've already lost, Aticinus said as he pushed both of his legs behind Perturabo's knees and choked him with his arm. Perturabo groped for his brother behind him, and with a smile stretched from ear to ear said, I know the real reason you retrieved Hector. You two only work together in futile attempts to best me. No chance with double or even triple the men. With that, he found purchase of his brother's shirt, bent slightly, and threw him over his shoulder. Aticinus fell on his back and dramatically feigned stumbling to his feet. He clutched his chest as he stood, not at the pain of the fall, but at the next flurry of words. Must you wound me so with your accusations? I swear, with how callously you use your words, you must want to tear this family apart. He wiped away at an imaginary tear. Perturabo raised an eyebrow. Am I wrong? Hector squirmed. You're not wrong, you're just an ass. With eyes closed and an indignant chin raised, Aticinus said, You must learn that you can be both right and wrong at the same time. While yes, I did get Hector to humble you here, it was not for that reason alone. Not for my meager ego, but for yours. As father said, an ego is like iron. Raw and left on its own, it is bloated, brittle, and more trouble than it's worth. But beaten down, wrought and tempered until it is small and focused, it becomes a tool, that could move mountains. It was Perturabo's turn to practice faux indignity, but he took a sour petulance, an almost spiteful glower. In turn, his brother raised an eyebrow. "Am I wrong, my big little brother?" The scowl melted away into a cool laugh. "Not at all. You and Father are correct. It's something I need to work on." He slapped a massive hand on his shoulder, shook him, and slid it across to pull him in for a side hug. "Now how did a shepherd become so wise? Only the gods know." His brother embraced him back, all the while Hector impotently flailed at Perturabo's side. After defending their homestead from multiple creatures, Perturabo convinced most of his family to move their home to a far more defensible location on a hill. Alcmene would budge only after Perturabo had fully constructed the home, and she had personally seen that it was thrice as big. The walls and towers surrounding their home were ashlar stone, made of what limestone he could source, and clay bricks for the rest. The hill crested to a flat patch of land with a short path to its wicket gate. The door within a door seemed excessive to the rest of the family for so remote a home, but Perturabo felt it necessary for practical and defensible use. Perturabo waited at the edge of the path, taking a wide stance with arms crossed, observing the pastoral landscape below. 9 men in white and gold armor marched up the path in 3 columns. The rifle-like blade-tipped weapons slung on their shoulders were as old as they were advanced. With the sun in their eyes, Perturabo's silhouette would have been easily mistaken for a statue, if not for the wildness of hair blowing behind him. The men stopped as one. Perturabo towered over them. The leading man of the center column stepped forward and into his shadow. "Are you the one known as Perturabo?" The wind swelled for a long moment and finally calmed before he spoke. "Yes. Who wants to know?" "Miltiades, sub-optio in the 97th Grand Company of Locos. Damikos, the tyrant of Locos, has ordered me to bring you to him, and so you shall come with me." "This tyrant, what is he to me?" "Your king." "My king? He does not for my flock, nor does he slay the beasts that harass my family. All I know of him is that he taxes my father and orders me to him. I'd say that is no king of mine." "Such insolence!" In one swift move, the man to the right of Miltiades had unslung the weapon from his back, and in an underhanded arc, swung the pommeled stock at Perturabo's head. Without ever taking his eyes off of Miltiades, Perturabo caught the pommel in his bare right hand. Such aggression. Speaking true words sends him into such a paroxysm. I see the measure of the men this so-called tyrant sends to retrieve me. After a few impotent yanks, Perturabo opened his hand. "That was your one free strike. Swing again and learn the cost." Wide blue eyes shone down despite the shade of his forehead. Miltiades had just begun to raise his hand to stay his subordinate, but it was too late. The man's face twisted into a snarl. The hubris of this peasant was too much for one of his breeding to bear. Swinging the blade-tipped weapon around into a forward grip, it slid down further in his hand. He took a quick step forward and to the right, away from the sub-optio, and ducked into a crouch. He thrusted. Perturabo caught the blade in his hand inches from his face. He yanked hard, pulling the blade behind his head. It caught the man off guard, causing him to stumble forward. Perturabo grabbed him by the throat and lifted him into the air. He squirmed, kicking as the other men readied their weapons. All the while, Perturabo never took his eyes off Miltiades. Miltiades looked over and examined the weapon in the dirt. The pommel had crumpled slightly, leaving the imprint of a massive palm. He looked back up, with eyes adjusted to the light, and Perturabo came into focus. Waist down was fully encased in armor, whose quality rivaled their own. The muscle of his bare torso seamlessly flowed from the metal, as if it grew from within. You come to my home uninvited and unannounced. You demand of me as if you were entitled to my obedience. After engaging in the very barest of communication, you attempt to take my life. For what? For questioning you? If I were not here, what would you do? Would you do the same to those less able to defend themselves? Would you take a swing at my brittle father, huh? How about my ill mother? As Perturabo spoke, his eyes darted back from Miltiades to this man. His words became more heated and his hand involuntarily tightened. The man's kicks became more desperate, and with his face reddening, he began to choke and gurgle. Perturabo bared his teeth, and a shiver ran down the other men's backs at the sight. "These are not the actions of a rational man, but of a beast unable to be tamed and a danger to those it is near. What do you do with such a beast?" The last few words were spoken with wide eyes. Perturabo's forearm was tensed and dangerously vascular with effort. For the last seconds of the soldier's life, Perturabo stared through him. He did not register the nails shallowly digging into his arm before they fell away. When Perturabo came to, the man's kicking had already ceased. He released, and the man ungracefully collapsed to the floor. The sound of the armor shifting uneasily was audible despite the picking up wind. Miltiades firmly grasped the pistol at his waist, while his other hesitant hand was halfway up to give an order before it was interrupted. The words came deep from Perturabo's chest. "Relax. I shall go with you. Take his body from my land and do not return." Perturabo walked into the shadow where the gate and wall met. He slid on a breastplate that matched his legs in quality. He walked down through the skittish men with a spiked warhammer in hand, its head sized for a maul but resting on a shortened shaft. As he made his way halfway down the hill, he turned and asked, "Come in." Miltiades pushed through to Perturabo. "You will pay for this." "Someone will," Perturabo said without breaking stride. They had not made it past the pasturage before they could hear the sounds of yelling coming from the house. It was Aticinus, sprinting down. Perturabo met him halfway. Aticinus, breathing hard, rested his hands on his knees. "Where are you going?" "To Locos." "But Father said—" "I understand. But listen. Father always said the towns and cities were filled with vipers, Locos especially, but these men are from the tyrant himself. You know better. Do you think they will accept no—" After a moment, Aticinus straightened. The top of his head now only reached the middle of Perturabo's chest. No, I don't imagine they would." "Exactly. What am I to do? Slay each and every man they send our way? I've bloodied my hands enough today." It took Aticinus a second to understand his meaning. He looked over, down at the other men, and saw the one carried by two. He was lost for words, and could only eke out a single "Brother," Perturabo confirmed with a solemn nod. "Facing that is not my only intention. I suspect Hector may be in Locos. It has been 2 weeks since you returned from town without him. Is that not the journey time to Locos? Worst case, it will be as good as any place to start my search." Aticinus, despite being the oldest, was the simplest in his virtues and did not stomach drama well. He looked to the side, eyes darting with each thought, the indecision tearing at him. "I do not know. I think we should wait, convene at home and then decide. If it is half as bad as Father said, then we do not have time. I have not saved my brother from one serpent, just to lose him to another. I will bring him back. You should go home. Tend to the flock and take care of mother and father. They need you." Aticinus embraced his brother. "As we need you. Farewell."